Hi everyone, my name is Megan McDonald. I'm Public Relations Manager at CBIA, and I'm hosting today's webinar. This is the fourth webinar in our 5-part cybersecurity series. Today we'll explore how to minimize damage from a cyber attack if you find yourself hacked. We'll discuss who you need to notify, potential costs, and more. Thanks to AT&T, BlumShapiro, Cooperative Systems, KeyBank, and Eversource for their generous sponsorship, making it possible to offer these sessions to you free of cost. I just have a couple housekeeping things to go through quickly. First, in addition to this webinar series, CBIA is surveying business leaders about their company's cybersecurity habits and protections to identify gaps in cybersecurity protocol and pinpoint opportunities for CBIA and other organizations to help small to mid-sized business safeguard their most important information. Many of you should have received an email about it. But if you've taken the time to complete the brief survey, thank you. If you haven't done so, we would appreciate your participation. This is really just to see where CBIA can really help business owners and business leaders like yourself on protecting your information. The survey results will be presented at CBIA's 2018 Economic Summit and Outlook on January 5th. Like other cybersecurity webinars we've had, we will be taking questions. This time, however, feel free to ask them throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring the text chatting system on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you have a question, please feel free to ask it at any time. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted to CBIA's website for later viewing by you or others in your organization who you think might benefit from the material. We'll be sending out an email afterwards to all attendees with a link to the event recording online, as well as a link to the PDF of the presentation. Also, our two presenters' contact information will be posted within the material should you wish to follow up. And so we are very lucky today to have two presenters from BlumShapiro. Jeff Ziplow is a partner in BlumShapiro's consulting group, and he is responsible for the firm's risk management and process controls practice areas. He has significant experience working with organizations to assess their internal IT controls as they relate to business operations and helps to develop recommendations to mitigate risk. He oversees the firm's cybersecurity risk assessments and provides insight and guidance on developing better security practices. Jeffrey is joined by his colleague David Nowacki. As a manager in BlumShapiro's consulting group, David has over 15 years of combined experience with management consulting and information security. He has worked with both government agencies and private businesses in developing security strategies, governance, and enterprise risk management practices, and business continuity programs. David is a member of the risk management group at BlumShapiro, specializing in cyber services. So now here's where I hand it over to you, Jeffrey and David, and here we go.
Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you all for joining us today. This is a little bit different type of situation that we're in because David and I are in a room presenting together. Normally we do this independently and separate, but we all thought it would be great to have a dialogue. And so throughout the presentation, David might be asking me questions or I might be asking David questions, and I will assure everyone that we don't have anything pre-set up, and that'll make it more fun and exciting for all of us. What I wanted to do is spend a little bit of time and share with everyone what we wanted to go through today. We want to talk about the impact of the Internet, certainly some current news about the Internet, and I think we're all seeing more and more a lot of related issues and problems coming up based on the Internet. The business impact, but certainly spend a lot of time talking about how we can minimize cyber attacks, what an incident response will look like or could look like, and also get into a dialogue and discussion about who needs to be part of that incident response and who needs to understand and be aware of problems that we're having from a cybersecurity perspective. So with that, let me just move forward with this slide, which I thought was very interesting. And the reason I wanted to put it out there is, if you look at what happens in 60 seconds on the internet, I was just actually amazed. So within 60 seconds, there's 16 million text messages. There is, a tremendous amount of information going on. Look at Netflix, 70,000 hours being watched. I was going to jump over to tweets, but I think we're going to stay away from tweets today. But 156 million emails sent in 60 seconds. And the point of this slide, and what I really wanted to put out there, is the internet is not only part of our daily lives, it's intertwined with many of the things that we do on a regular basis. When we communicate with someone, we're communicating through the internet in some way, shape, or form. When we're sharing information between companies, between employees, we're doing it through the internet. And that's all the good news. However, the bad news is we now have this global network that we need to be careful of because of gaps and holes within that network that could expose us to significant issues and problems. So I just wanted to share with everyone a little bit about what's going on in the news. And I brought up a bunch of information on the screen related to phishing. And I bring it up because we're seeing a tremendous increase on the number of cyber attacks through phishing. And we're starting to see more and more schemes, if you will, that start off through phishing and end up with information about user credentials to allow those cyber attackers to get access to your specific system. In particular, I want to point to the bottom of the screen, the Equifax breach. And from what we know right now, it was a situation because a particular, it's known as an Apache system, but it wasn't patched, or updates to the operating system weren't patched, and there was a known gap or a known exposure in the Apache software system. But the key part of what I wanted to share with all of you is that there were two pieces of information that were exposed in this particular breach that I believe will have a significant and major impact not only today but in the years to come. Those two pieces of information were Social Security number and birth dates. And those two pieces of information are important because they're used in many different ways. To take a loan out, you need Social Security number and birth date. The problem with those two pieces of information is they don't change in your lifetime. Although we would love to change our birth dates, David. I'm sure you would anyway.
Absolutely.
But the reality is, those two pieces of information don't change, and as a result, we can see the effects of the Equifax breach, not only today or tomorrow, but more importantly, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. And so I think we all need to be aware of that type of information, and equally important, how can we protect our own information within our own businesses?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note the widespread impact of that Equifax breach on everyone. I think take a look at the rest of the headlines. It's not uncommon to see 5 or 10 of these hit your either inbox if you have data breach alerts set up, or if you're out visiting any one of the news portals. Headlines like this are out there, and organizations like yours are being targeted, whether it's phishing, spear phishing, which is a more direct way to target someone through a phishing attack, the fake CEO scam or business email compromise. You look in the middle, $2.3 billion lost to CEO email scams, and that's a type of attack where they socially engineer you to provide information or wire or ACH financial transactions to a different location than where it's supposed to be going. And so these have hit Connecticut businesses. It's certainly hit government entities and other sectors as well. And no one is immune to this type of attack. And we'll talk a little bit later on, or in the next slide, about the direct growth that is associated with email as an attack vector. The reason why it's growing is because everyone has it, everyone uses it, and everyone responds to it.
So why don't we take a look at that, David?
Sure, and this is a very simple graph that shows the growth of malicious email attachments. And this spans a 2-year period from January 15th to the end of 16, and so this doesn't even incorporate this year. But what it equates to is over the course of 2 years, and most importantly the last year, the amount of spam that's in your inbox that also includes something that's targeting you as some type of a cyber victim has increased 4 to 5-fold in a short amount of time, and it's growing even more exponentially than that. What that means is, just by sheer numbers, with all of the controls you may have in place from a security perspective, spam filtering, and a variety of other things are going to start to get through the crack. It's not a matter of if, it's when, and things that we'll talk about later on, like employee awareness, making sure that you have adequate protections and core critical security controls in place, is vitally important to limit your opportunity to have a massive breach as opposed to a minor breach or a non-breach. And so just by sheer numbers, you're going to have things that get through your controls.
Well, and I guess that begs the question, well, is there anything that is impenetrable? Is there anything that we can do and put in place that will limit or not expose us to these email threats?
Yeah, and yes, there is preventative measures. There are some using things, not to get too technical, but DMARC is a standard for email servers that allows you to basically communicate malicious domains that are known to send either pure spam or malicious spam. So there are things like that. If you haven't engaged with your IT people about, have you adopted DMARC? Especially if you have on-premise Exchange or email servers, certainly it may be an unknown as to whether you've adopted it. If you use email service providers or Office 365, they already have it. If you use Gmail or other things like that, they have it already. So those are preventative measures, but it only prevents certain types of attacks.
So this thing called DMARCs, if you have your own internal email system, folks should ask their IT folks, is that in place right now? Is there a cost to that, David, or how does that work?
No, it's, with most basic licensing, you can enable DMARC. It's just a setting, but it requires reboots and things like that. And I would say ask your IT folks or your managed service provider, if you have a managed service provider, as to what it would take to actually implement that.
Got it. Well, one of the other things about malicious emails is the viruses or malware that can be associated with it. One of the things that I think we've been talking to our clients about, David, is having multiple levels of inspection of emails. So we want to have email inspection, certainly within the email server, but also have the email inspection through antivirus at the server level and at the PC level as well. Does it make sense to use the same software for everything, or should we break it up into different, or use different vendor softwares to hopefully inspect and protect us better?
Yeah, using different layers of protection is always a good thing. If you get email, some organizations route all of their email through a email scanning or an anti-spam service before it even hits their servers. So that's one layer of protection you could look at. You could look at Barracuda devices as one of the more popular ones for looking for examining spam, but certainly looking at antivirus. Again, it's going to get through, and so have antivirus on your endpoints, workstations, laptops, having it on the server, and having it, if you have the ability to do it, on the perimeter firewall as well, that specifically looks for viruses in traffic, is also a good practice.
Sounds good. One of the other points I certainly want to make now, and in particular, we're moving into the flu season, but we're also moving into the W-2 season. And I bring up W-2 season because, you know, in the month of January and February, because of the federal government, we need to send out, or businesses need to send out, you know, the W-2 information, both to employees as well as to the federal government. And the reason that I'm bringing this up for discussion, or at least to make everyone aware of it, is we have seen a number of cyber attacks, phishing attacks in the past that are requesting W-2 information from the HR or payroll department coming from an executive. And I think that, you know, it's important to start questioning whether or not that is a true and legitimate email. There were a couple of instances in Connecticut last year with a couple of school departments, quite frankly, public school departments, that the superintendent was reaching out to someone in HR or payroll and, you know, requesting all the W-2 information. And the reality of it is that because it was the superintendent, i.e. the CEO, they were sent that information. Well, the reality is it was a spear phishing attack, and they sent it out. They sent W-2 information out to, you know, the attackers. And unfortunately, if you think of what's in a W-2, social security number, I have an address, I also have what someone made for that year. So all those pieces of information can be used to take out a loan and or used to take a credit card. And so I think, you know, what we're trying to suggest here, or what I'm trying to suggest, is please be aware and talk to your employees about this W-2 season coming up. Make them aware of what your expectations are. Make them aware of what their expectations should be. And at the very least, make sure that people pick up the phone. If something doesn't seem right or smell right, pick up the phone and ask the person directly. Don't make any assumptions.
Yeah, and that's in addition to having, I know we're talking about email here, but having basic protocols in place to not use email as a communication tool for things like W-2s. It should go without saying to most organizations, but it's surprising how many people still use email. Some use encrypted, some don't, but sending sensitive information over an unencrypted channel should not be acceptable, and it should be in your basic policies, in addition to what Jeff suggested, which is the independent validation of the source of that request.
So I think enough about emails. I want to go on to ransomware. And I wanted to just show everyone, we won't spend a whole lot of time here, but ransomware is that malware or software that gets put onto a computer, and it encrypts not only information on the computer, but any network drives that it can see from that computer, it'll encrypt the information. And we're seeing an explosion of ransomware, of people going out and downloading this malware onto their PC. And the way it works is that it encrypts all this information, and then on the screen it says, if you want the key to decrypt the information, you need to pay us $300. You need to pay us $1,000. And I will answer up front that 99% of the time you do get that encryption key if you pay for it. You do pay for it in Bitcoin, but the reason that you will get that encryption key is they want people to pay the ransom. And if anyone gets the sense that they won't pay the ransom, well, then you have problems. But any thoughts on ransomware, David?
Yeah, I mean, ransomware is a full-on industry. This has completely changed the way that threats approach their targets, because, as Jeff mentioned, the industry, the growth of the industry, and the financial stability of people who are relying, you know, on this income source, it depends on you paying the ransom. So they will 100% of the time, or 99% of the time, they will give you the key because they'll know you pay it, you'll spread word of mouth, and it was somewhat easy to obtain $2,000 in Bitcoin, and that it was decrypted. The graph or the chart that you see on the screen there is the growth and variance of ransomware. So it used to be that there was one or two. You look back at 05, 12, 13, there were a few common versions. And now the way that it operates and the weaknesses that they prey upon have changed so drastically that it's almost difficult to get to keep up with. These operations that run ransomware are very well funded. In some cases, you guys have heard of software as a service or cloud service providers. Well, on the dark web, there are ransomware as a service providers where you can actually invest in a massive ransomware operation. There are also open source ransomware kits that allow individuals or groups to get into ransomware easily without having to program all of it from scratch. And so you can use that open source software and modify it and create your own variant of ransomware. It's a very, very scary industry on the whole.
So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the business impact. And I won't spend much time on the slide, but what I did want to share with you is if you look at the middle of the screen, are small businesses a target? The answer is yes. And they tend to be an easier target because a lot of times some of the smaller businesses don't necessarily have the technology or resources in place to validate and make sure that that they're protected. So we're starting to see the cyber criminals out there going after the smaller businesses, which unfortunately there's a high proportion of cybercrime cost, and certainly can have a much more significant impact or disruptive impact, if you will, if there is a data breach from both a short and long-term perspective. So, are small businesses being attacked? The answer is yes, and certainly we want to provide information today that will help identify ways to minimize attacks and be in a position to have your best foot forward in resolving those attacks as quickly as possible. So just some of the common themes of cyber attacks, the patching of software. I mentioned Equifax, that was a result of that. Password length. I've changed my approach on password length. We've had discussions in the past where you should rotate your password every 60 to 90 days. Well, I would say we can make it much longer if we're willing to use a longer password. If I use a password that is 12 characters or longer, and I did say the word 12, the ability for someone to run it through a password cracker, if you will, it would take thousands of years. But if it goes back to only 8 characters, it can be done in typically an hour or 2. We talked about antivirus, but it is important, and what we've seen is it is important to make sure that your antivirus software is working effectively. The phishing emails we talked about, the ransomware, we'll get into it in a little bit more detail, but certainly training employees is an important factor.
Yeah, and I'd like to add just that a lot of these things, they're common themes that result in a cyber attack. The theme of this presentation is kind of limiting the scope or limiting the impact. Well, this is one of the ways to be a little bit proactive. If you're a smaller business, you may not have IT staff. You may rely entirely on your managed service provider. So make sure you are talking to them about security, not just basic support, because it isn't included in all base level of support. If you need to move up a little bit in terms of investment, monthly or annual investment, you should do that. It isn't just a luxury. Security isn't just a luxury anymore. It's a necessity. It is among the biggest risks to any business out there.
So let's move on to the wheel, David.
Yeah, so the The diagram on the screen is a bit overwhelming, but this is a diagram that kind of outlines the Center for Internet Security is one of the leading thought leadership and actually preventative sources for how to do security well, specifically in the Internet, an Internet-connected world, which I think we all are today. So this diagram outlines 20 critical cybersecurity controls. Now, you could have a lot more than 20, but these are critical controls that you should have in your organization or be striving for to minimize the majority of the popular threats. And, you know, I won't go down the list of everything, but I would say if you haven't, you or your IT support staff have not looked at security, this is a good start. At CIS Security, I think it's .org, but it has a list of what the definitions are and how you should be implementing these types of controls as well.
So David, if I forced you to pick out of these 20, I'll call it the top 5 or the top 10, no more than 10, which one would they be?
Yeah, for most businesses, I would look at number 17 as being among the most critical. Number 17 is security skills assessment and appropriate training to fill the gaps. This is teaching people who are traditionally not trained in security. They're trained in enabling the business to be productive and availability of resources to actually think from a security perspective, think like an attacker, think a worst case scenario, and proactively getting better over time. So that's one of them. From that will stem, and I look at both bullets 3 and 4, secure configurations of hardware and software, continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation. This is where you look at how your devices, your servers, your systems and applications are actually configured. So again, you're going to have to engage with your staff or IT staff or managed service providers on how to do that. And it may take some time. There may need to be some business impact to improve an existing configuration, but looking at how you're configuring for security.
But I want to go back to item 4, the continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation. I mean, my sense is in clients that we work with, that's not something people are doing on a regular basis.
No, and absolutely not. So typically what happens is people will have a vulnerability management program or a patch management program, and that's it. They tend to look at what patches are missing and install and deploy them. But they don't proactively scan for missing patches, for unnecessary services, for misconfigured software.
Right.
And among the bigger risks out there are third-party software. So that's your Microsoft Office, that's Adobe, that's Java, things that aren't applied via a Windows update or an auto-update feature. You have to manually patch those or have a program specialized to identifying holes in those. And so absolutely people don't have that in place. It's a very good practice to have an independent consultant of some sort who specializes in vulnerability assessments, doing that annually at a very minimum, preferably quarterly or more frequently, to look at your infrastructure, to look at your software to see where the holes may be.
Got it.
And then I would say two that go hand in hand, probably the most important from a ransomware perspective is data recovery capability. We didn't get much into aside from the initial description of ransomware, but one of the best ways to not have to pay the ransom is have an ability to recover your data.
That's item 10 on the list.
Item number 10 on the list.
Got it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that is to have a reliable, proven, and most importantly, tested backup or data recovery capability will save you a lot of headaches and it will save you a lot of money over time as well.
I guess the only thing I would add there is one should ask the IT department, right, or whoever is in charge of doing backups, when was the last time we did a restore and validated that the data that we are backing up is actually available to us on a restoration process. I bring that up because we, again, we're trying to provide hindsight to everyone and experience to everyone. There have been a number of times in the past couple of years where a client has said, oh yes, we back up and we test. And what they didn't realize is the information or the folder or series of files that they needed today or they needed to restore today were not something they were backing up. And so you run into this problem where, yes, we do backups, but and sometimes we do test the backups, but have we ever validated all the information that we're backing up?
Yeah. I would say very good points. All in all, one of the things that is not explicitly called out here that falls into several categories is the use of encryption. So encryption is probably the easiest, best way to keep you from getting data breached. May not prevent a system breach, may not prevent the loss of an asset, but if you can't read your data, or if the attackers can't read your data, technically you are not breached. And there are exemptions in many data breach legislation that exempts encrypted data as a breach. If you can confirm or affirm that the data that was lost was encrypted, it won't count as a breach from a regulatory perspective in some jurisdictions. And that's where you need to be familiar about the laws in which you the jurisdictions in which you do business.
Well, I also think that brings us to the next slide, if you will, which is, confirming what data needs to be protected. All too often, we make assumptions that we don't store this information or that information. Certainly, we've all heard about HIPAA and storing personal information, EPHI information. Many organizations, many companies store that. But we're not sure of all the information that we do store. David, how would you recommend people be proactive on this? What do they need to do?
Yeah, I would say it's an undertaking. If you've never evaluated the location of where data is, I think you start with very basic initiatives or projects or assessments that involve interviewing individuals who may use data. Where do you store it? If you have any type of a common drive or a common folder structure or shared drive structure in your environment, make sure that you talk to people about where they're storing data, where they receive data. Controlling the flow of information from intake to usage to distribution, I think is important. So undergoing some type of initiative, and it doesn't have to be difficult, but just to have that conversation about where it's stored, where it's transmitted, where it's sent, and more importantly, how, is a good start. Understanding data that may be subject to regulation that you may not know about is another way to approach it. Asking the question about HIPAA data is a good example. Asking the question about classified information if you do work with the government, or unclassified information. There's new regulations related to control unclassified information that wasn't subject to protections before. So when you approach it from a compliance perspective, sometimes you look at data a little bit differently, and where it could be contained in other parts of your networks or applications.
Well, and I would say, David, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we're starting to see more and more companies that are working with the federal government or Department of Defense in some way, shape, or form, as not even as a prime, but even as a sub to a sub to a sub, are need to make sure that the information that they have under this umbrella called CUI, and CUI stands for
Control Unclassified Information.
Right, and there are specific requirements to ensuring that it is controlled, that information hopefully is encrypted or it's secured in a way that it doesn't have broad-ranging access to all users within the organization.
Yes, and you're 100% correct there. This type of regulation applies to everybody, not just primary contractors as well.
So another standard out there is FTI, federal tax information. So if we're storing federal tax information of any sort, we're subject to the IRS 1075. And I guess not to throw numbers out to everyone, but we're starting to see more and more organizations require more security, stricter security over information that they have, and as a result, we are certainly telling our clients that it is important to know what information you have, where it's stored, and equally important, who has access to it. And certainly, we would highly recommend, keeping a least privilege access to information as your overall strategy to allowing people access to that information.
Yeah, and I would add, a lot of organizations don't have the budgets or the capabilities to do a least privilege approach. But I would say lowest or lower privilege than you are right now. Most organizations are so lax that they're really opening the window to possible data breaches or data leakage.
Sounds good. I did want to go and spend just 1 or 2 moments on this slide. The key point of this slide in my mind, David, is this thing called a WISP, a Written Information Security Program, which outlines and provides a company's internal policies, procedures, and protocols on how we are going to secure our entire environment. And if you don't have a WISP, you should certainly look at implementing one. You can go on the internet and certainly get the framework of what a WISP is. If you're a person or a company in Massachusetts, you have to have a WISP. And quite frankly, I think many states are heading down that same path.
Yeah. And one of the things we'll start to see here in the next year to 2 years is industries adopting and requiring that. So not just states, but industry groups. The state of New York recently adopted a standard for any financial institution that does business in the state of New York is required to have an information security program and a cybersecurity program as well. And it's among the most strict I've seen. And I think other industry groups within states will start to adopt that as well, not just in financial services. So that's coming around the corner. It's better to be ahead of it
than behind it, no doubt. So let me go next to, how we might consider minimizing, cyber attacks. I wanted to share all of this with you. NIST is a quasi-federal agency that oversees or has developed, I'll call it, various standards for our federal government. And David, you remember what NIST stands for?
I believe it's National Institute of Science and Technology.
Standards and Technology. By the way, that was one of those questions that I certainly didn't ask David ahead of time. So this organization, and you can go out to it, I believe it's NIST.gov, but they've developed a number of different frameworks. One of the frameworks is a cybersecurity framework, and in some ways it provides you with a global understanding of things that you should consider as it relates to cybersecurity and protecting yourself and your company from cybersecurity. And it breaks it out into these 5 areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It's actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's a great framework, and it's any NIST document is going to be fairly lengthy, but this is among the best from a practical application perspective. And what I really like about this framework is that it allows for maturing practices over time. It actually has a maturity model that's associated with it. So if you want to pick it up and adopt it, it gives you a path to self-assess and then over time improve how you do across these 5 domains.
And if I'm not mistaken, David, it actually has a spreadsheet that provides some pretty good detailed information. We're not doing it justice in this one slide in front of us, but it's a fairly detailed self-assessment. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very detailed self-assessment, and it gives you plenty of explanations on how to answer questions.
Sounds good. The breakout that NIST provides, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, are those natural steps that we need to be considering?
Yes, yeah, correct. You can't protect what you don't know. That's the identify. So it's a logical progression between the 2, identify, protect, detect, and then among the most critical is that red one, and it's appropriately colored for red, respond. To be able to respond quickly to a data breach scenario is vitally important.
Sounds good. Layered security. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but what are your thoughts on layered security? What do we need to let people know about specifically?
Yeah, I think take one example that's in the slide, like access management. Access can be applied not just to applications, not just to network credentials, but to hubs, switches, routers, to places where data is backed up and stored. So something as simple as access could have multiple layers of vulnerability. And so you need to make sure from a security perspective you're looking at that in volumes. And then there's an approach where you may have a vulnerability or you may have an opening or lack of security, but if you're behind a firewall, internal firewall that is behind an EMZ that has a variety of tactics to proxy your access to the internet, and I won't define that term, but it's a way to have a server take control of your internet session and route traffic as if it was you, and it provides an additional layer. That's one way to add layers to security, to not have your users directly access the internet.
But I also think that as part of this layered security, we need to have implement some type of ongoing program that is going to scan our network, look at the logs of the various devices on our network to say, hey, is anything going on? And if there's, some issue that is identified, there needs to be a mechanism in place so that, management knows about it. And it doesn't get lost in the shuffle of all these network devices that we have on our network.
Yeah, and absolutely. And looking at things differently, depending on which layer you're trying to secure, is a good thing. So if you've always done vulnerability scans at the network level, for example, maybe look at it at the application level. Look at it from an internal perspective versus an external. That's a different way to look at a potential threat, is what would the threat look like if they had a little bit of information and were inside your network already? What layers would need to be implemented to make it harder for someone once they've come in from the outside or access your location physically?
And again, if you have data that needs to be secured and it's encrypted, you're in a much better position if someone were to, get into your network, a cyber attacker, and try to run away with that data. If it was encrypted, then what they have is not worth much.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Training. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes on employee training. This is an area that I think most businesses need to spend more time on. Your employees can be your biggest or best asset for mitigating cybersecurity issues or incidents, or they can be the biggest liability. And I think it's either one or the other, right? And in a lot of the cybersecurity incidents that we have seen, a key component of how someone got into the network has to do with an employee, in many instances, an employee responding to a phishing attack and providing credentials. And we need to do a much better job of training our employees, not just once a year, but on an ongoing basis, that they will do their best to protect us, our company, our network, and if they have any questions or issues, they need to feel comfortable that they can go out and talk to the IT department, talk to management. This is not just an IT issue.
Yes.
And really get a sense of, hey, something isn't right, and validate it.
Absolutely, and looking at different ways of layering, so to speak, your training onto people. There's traditional classroom-based or facilitator-led training exercises. There's web, e-learning. You can quiz individuals. You can let them know of common threats and trends. And the next generation of training is to continuously test and assess your employees. And there are online e-learning / phishing platforms, and we happen to use one of them we believe very strongly. And so if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out. But it's very powerful to be able to continuously test all your employees across your organization with spoofed email that aren't malicious, but it mimics the exact threat that they may see every single day in their inbox, and it'll prompt them for credentials or ask them to click on a link, and you'll get real reporting and data that shows how your organization did over time. And as you reinforce messaging through a variety of different training methods, you'll see improvement over time. And it's one of the most powerful trends in security that I've seen is this evolution into continuous assessment of your employees and reinforcing training methods.
And I think the only thing I'd like to add on that is, you answer this question. If an employee found a USB or thumb drive device on the ground in the parking lot or somewhere in your facility, what would they do with it? Option A is they would throw it away in the trash. Option B would be they would hand it over to the IT department. Option C would be they would, hook it up to their computer to see whose information it was so they can hand it back to the person. Option A and B are good solutions. Option C, which is I plug it into something, is not a good solution. What would your employees do? So, David, let's move on to incident response. What I've provided, or what we've provided, is a typical game plan: preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery. Would you say those are the 5 key ingredients of an incident response plan or program?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's in that order. The preparation we've covered in a couple different slides, but I think most importantly is to have a written incident response program and to refine that over time. To consistently seek to improve incident response and communication for when a data breach is in place. And to be able to, that second tier, to be able to identify when an incident occurs allows you to proactively address security risks. There's some data out there that shows the average attacker should spend about 20 days in a network, or 200 days in a network before it's discovered. So to make that 200 days 10 days or 4 days instead through proactive identification is key. Containment of that. Once you know there's a breach, you need to contain it. That's through communication. That's through disconnecting resources if it's a network-based attack and a variety of other things. Eradication is usually pretty hefty with a data breach scenario. You're removing networks or viruses from your assets. And then recovery is key as well.
Sounds good. I think what I'd like to do, David, is let's spend just a few minutes on the preparation side, right?
Yep.
So, I strongly believe in having some type of documented incident response plan. Trying to create a plan on the fly, if in fact you know that you've been attacked or hacked, is probably not a really good approach. And one of it is, building that team. Because it's not, and I want to be very clear about this, building a team on an incident response situation, it's not, we don't just go to the IT department and say, oh, IT, you're now responsible of this. It's broader than that, isn't it, David?
Yeah, that's correct. And again, a lot of incident response has to do with communication. So internal communication people, executive teams. If you have an organization that has multiple branches, make sure you're talking to branches as well. Having those critical vendors identified who may be able to assist you in that timely manner is also key. So your team may span outside your organization as well.
Sounds good. I mean, I also think, who needs to be contacted? And I want to have a pause here because, once you have your team in place, one of the first, you're going to get your team together and you're going to identify what's going on, why we think there's an incident, right, I would imagine. And we're going to, use our incident response plan to, initiate a number of different activities, right? One of the activities, and I'm planting the stake in the ground, and I'm interested in what you think, David, is you need to have a conversation with an attorney, right? And it can't be any old attorney. It needs to be an attorney that has and works with, works within the legal system as it relates to cybersecurity incidents and who needs to be reported, who needs to get some type of notification. Because certainly the state may need to be notified. We may have federal agencies that need to be notified. And then we need to have a game plan of potentially contacting those people that whose information may have been breached. So we've got a number of different layers or levels of communication that needs to go on. Having an attorney, and we're not promoting one, but having an attorney, part of your team, ahead of time is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And the moment that you reasonably suspect a breach has occurred, where an incident turns into a breach, and you think personal information may have been compromised, the clock starts to tick. So you have a reasonable amount of time to do an investigation to confirm, was there an incident, was there a breach, and who was impacted. But it's not a long time, depending on how many organizations or how many states you do business in. It can be very short. In Connecticut, you have 90 days, or the lesser if it's a federal equivalent. So if you have public health information, it's 60 days per HIPAA. So there's, at a minimum, you have to notify the Attorney General, and you have to start to notify the affected individuals within 90 days of suspecting there's a breach that has happened.
And in Rhode Island is 45 days. So, everything's all over the place. And I guess my point is that working with an attorney who knows what they're doing will certainly help the overall process and will help identify who and what needs to be contacted. And I'm going to go back to this discussion we had earlier, David, about encryption of data. There's a very different story to tell if your data was encrypted and you had a breach versus having a breach and recognizing that the data wasn't encrypted.
Yep, and that's one of the things you're going to want to do in the identification or containment phase, is to understand what data was breached. And the legislation in Connecticut, for example, as one of the definitions is first name, last name, and a primary identifier, which could be Social Security number or an ID number or something like that. Well, if that's encrypted, it's categorically excluded from the breach. So if you can confirm that your data was encrypted, and that probably means encrypted when it's stored or at rest, in addition to encrypted when it was transmitted, you're probably okay, but you need to be able to evaluate that in a timely fashion as well.
And that attorney can help understand and help with the evaluation process, and certainly be the conduit to the Attorney General's office or any one of the other federal agencies that you may need to contact.
Yes, correct.
Sounds good. Anything else about incident response that you want to share?
Well, I think in all of this, the most important component of incident response is learning from past mistakes. So if you don't have an incident response plan and you experience an incident, you need to learn by putting a plan together, and that goes for any process going forward. Make sure you're evaluating and testing that, whether it's intended or unintended, that you improve incident response over time.
Sounds good. So I guess we're getting to the end of our presentation and to our allotted time. I guess what we wanted to share with you is that there are things that you as business owners can do. As folks, even if you're not a business owner, but someone who works in a business, sitting through the presentation, to understand what some of these challenges are, having a roadmap for your security programs and practices and having it documented is really important. We talk about that WISP, the Written Information Security Program. that's an important document because it kind of sets the stage to create the culture of what cybersecurity and what security overall is within your organization, which is really bullet point number 2. I find it very difficult to create a culture of cybersecurity without having some type of document that outlines what we do and how we do it within our particular organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, employees, managers, they follow leaders. They follow people who are willing to have those tough discussions and admit that they may need some improvement. So making sure you emphasize the importance of cybersecurity, that tone at the top is vitally important. To involve it in the budget discussion, even if it may be an expensive topic to talk about, to make sure that you know that it's okay to talk about security and to budget for security. Some organizations are struggling at this time, and the cyber breaches, I wish I had clear data on the number of small businesses that were put out of business, but the costs are astronomical when you experience a breach. So any dollar you can spend is a dollar that will be returned by not being breached in the future.
Right. There's a bullet point: chat regularly with your CISO, your Chief Information Security Officer. I suspect most people don't have a CISO, particularly smaller, even mid-sized businesses don't have a CISO, David.
Yes.
So what do you do if you don't have one?
Yeah, so first is to probably designate someone to be responsible for it, and then the second is to seek out consultants or advisors as you need them to get a perspective on what information security should look like in your organization. To seek out, you know, CISO as a service providers to help, you know, get that independent perspective. But I think the most important thing is to make sure that someone is responsible for moving the bar forward, right? Even if that means it's different.
Well, and I would also suggest that whoever that person is should be having strong communications with the management team to say, hey, we're seeing a lot of these types of activities, just again to make everyone aware. This is not something we want to hide. This is something we want to put out in the open, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good. So I guess we're hitting the very end of our presentation. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to provide them. And if not, we want to thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share some information about helping to protect your environment related to cybersecurity.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey and David. That was great, and having both of you kind of play off each other was wonderful. I really enjoyed the change in format this webinar. Just before, I don't see any questions coming through, but feel free to ask them through the Q&A section on the webinar tool. But I hope everyone can make it to the next and final webinar in our series. On Thursday, December 7th, we'll discuss risk management plans with KeyBank Stuart Tosh. It'll be the last in our series. And again, if you've received an email asking you to participate in the CBA cybersecurity survey, please take the time to do it. We would really appreciate it here. I haven't seen any questions come through.
Not a problem.
Okay. All right. So
happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yes, have a happy and safe Thanksgiving, everyone. And thank you for joining us, and hopefully we will